Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back or welcome to my channel, whichever one it is for you. My name is Isaiah Presley Lafone, and I am so honored to welcome you to Kirk and Kingdom, an official podcast of Presbyterians for the Kingdom. I'm so pleased to have on today as the podcast's first guest a man that we all admire in the Reconquista community, and one who Richard Ackerman so greatly calls the Lion of Reconquista. This is Reverend Jake Dell. So, Reverend, how are you doing today? And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for those who may not be that too familiar with you?
Thank you, Isaiah. I'm doing well. It's good to talk to you. I'm glad we could work this out. I am the pastor of the First Congregational Church in Woodbury, Connecticut. It's a relatively recent call. Took it last November. And before that, many people will know I was a priest in the Episcopal Church I was ordained way back as a deacon in 2009, so I was in that for quite some time. And I got involved with Richard's movement sometime, I think, in 2023. I was one of the first people to profile it, write some articles for denominational magazines about it, connected them, the Episcopalians in his movement, with conservative groups in the Episcopal Church like Communion Partners, and was delighted to meet Richard in person in Dallas in the fall of 2023 when he came, and a number of others came to the Communion Partners meeting there. Communion Partners is part of the Anglican Communion Episcopal Church, larger movement, a body of faithful Orthodox bishops and clergy.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So to start out, I wanted to ask you, so kind of just explain like your call to ministry, what drew you to it, and just how all that process went down for you.
Well, it's funny because I look at Redeemed Zoomer, I look at Richard, and I look at your generation, and I see a mirror image of myself. I'm 52 years old. I'm Generation X. I grew up in these institutions in one way or another, and even back then, I could see that they were fraying around the edges. The attendance was going down, and although I didn't have the vocabulary to really articulate it at the time, they were clearly straying from their roots. So it's funny. I was actually baptized when I was 14 in the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA. So you can claim me if you. I guess all three denominations, the Episcopal Church, Congregational Church, and the Presbyterians, can claim me in one way or another. And I was going to, much like Richard, I didn't want anything to do with the big box mega churches that were around. So I found a small little Presbyterian church where I was the only person under 20 at that point. And they took me in and loved me and baptized me, and even made me a deacon and put me in charge of the very primitive, by today's standards, media. So I was in the back recording the sermons, producing cassette tapes. But that was my duties. That was my duties as the deacon. And I think that was probably the first time someone pulled me aside. This was a church that had a lot of retired missionaries in it, foreign missionaries. It was in near Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. So one of them took me aside at one point and said, "Have you ever thought you might have a call?" And I really didn't understand what he meant at that point, but I filed it in the back of my head. Couple of years later, I was back on the East Coast, where I was finishing up high school at a Presbyterian boarding school, Blair Academy. And I was fascinated by the institutional affiliation, the fact that it was still owned and operated by the Presbyterian Church, but you wouldn't know it if as a student there, you had no idea. Chapel services were so watered down. I think we had a Wednesday chapel service that was really just more of a chance to listen to a usually interesting outside speaker. And then on Sundays, there was a Vesper service, which you were required to attend at least once a month. But they could be anything from a mock Quaker service to a Buddhist or even a Muslim service. And, and I remember insisting that we broke out the old Blair Academy hymnals and sing hymns and have somebody play the organ. So even back then I was very concerned about these institutional drifts, and I wrote an article for the school journal about why the school needed to recover its Presbyterian Christian roots. And from there, I went on to Yale University. Same story, only in the congregational context. But it was about that time too that I had a sense of, I won't quite call it a Paul on the Damascus Road experience, but it did change me. I went to church one Sunday, Easter Sunday, at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, and I was overwhelmed by it. And I said to my dad as we walked out, I said, "That's what I'm going to do with my life." And he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Whatever that was, that's what I'm going to do." And so I tried to discern a call in the Episcopal Church almost immediately once I started college. So this would be the fall of 1991. And again, I started to run into the roadblocks that I think are so common right now, which are, well, you're conservative. You might want to tone down your affinity for things, the way things were. And I really just, kind of put off early on. I mean, personally, I became put off, alienated somewhat. And then, but even the institution in an informal way was definitely discouraging young people from going into the ministry. So I kind of wandered for a while, maybe close to a decade. And in the mid 2000s, around 2005, 2006, through a series of very fortuitous, providential occurrences, I was able to start attending seminary. So I went to Nashotah House, which was at that time pioneering a hybrid program where you could learn distance learning and also have on-campus cohort sessions of several times a year. A retired bishop who sort of believed in me took up my cause and paid for me to go to seminary. So God opens many doors and has in my life. And eventually I was ordained in the Episcopal Church through one of the conservative dioceses, one of those communion partner dioceses, the Diocese of Albany. Bishop William Love took me in and helped me get through the ordination process. And his story sort of mirrors mine. Around 2018, he refused to implement the mandate from General Convention that would require same-sex marriages to be performed in any diocese of the Episcopal Church. So they basically overruled his authority in that diocese, or at least that's how he saw it. And he refused, and he was eventually disciplined and was allowed to, I think, retire. So, and I remember thinking when that happened, I thought, well, this is the bishop who ordained me. I wonder how much longer I can last, or if there will be a place for me in the Episcopal Church. And you stop me if I'm going on too long, but I remember being on the floor of the General Convention in 2015 when within 48 hours, the Obergefell decision came down, and then General Convention changed the canons of the Episcopal Church to allow for same-sex marriage. And I was always one to get along with everyone, and I often considered it a point of pride that I had so many friends on the other side of the aisle, and all of them to a person said there would always be a place for me and people like me in the Episcopal Church. But over the next decade, I saw that really wasn't true. And shortly, after Bishop Love was, I think, forced out of the Episcopal Church, I found it impossible for me to find work in the Episcopal Church. So here I am.
Yeah, in my own personal experience, and you can correct me if this isn't yours, but unless you are on the progressive, theologically liberal train, you're going to get run over eventually. Would that be your experience?
That's been my experience, and I think I was sort of I got very good at being at hiding in plain sight, would probably be a good way to put it. And people knew. I mean, you don't get ordained by the Diocese of Albany or go to Nashotah House without having it stamped on your on your CV that you're basically a conservative, right? I mean, you're right. Saying that without saying it. And truly, for a long time, it was possible to coexist in the Episcopal Church that way. We could say it without saying it. That, I think, became impossible after 2020, at least in some of the some parts of the church. And if you watch what happened at the National Cathedral during the inauguration, I think that's the barometer now. That's the current temperature of these progressives. They have turned the dial up past 10 and made it so that if you're not in lockstep conformity, you will be hounded out. And so the old church, the old, sort of, for lack of a better word, sort of gentlemen's and ladies, for that matter, agreement that we all had, that there really would be an accommodation for everyone. That big tent collapsed sometime after 2020, and this ideology was just let loose. And I'm hoping that can be dialed back at some point, because it's poisonous, and it's destroying the institution.
Right. So, you mentioned your call up to this point. Now, at a certain point, something happens where you have to leave the Episcopal Church, and now you're in this Congregationalist church. Walk us through that exactly.
So, I took a call. I've served 3 churches. My first church was in New York City. My second church was in Dutchess County, New York State. Lovely, old village church, a quaint country church in a beautiful part of the country. If you're familiar with the Hudson River School of Art or the Hudson River Valley, it's one of the most beautiful places you could ever be. And I loved pastoring there. But there was certainly, I think, we were out of step theologically. I was much more evangelical. I was much more, I really wanted to preach the gospel, right? And I think a lot of people responded to that. Other people thought maybe it was a little too much for them, right? If I went over 10 minutes on a sermon, I was usually getting the stink eye. So, my vision of being like J.C. Ryle or whatever and doing Charles Simeon and doing expository preaching kind of got derailed. But that having been said, I think there was a real disagreement among some that they were not happy that they had a minister who wouldn't do same-sex marriages. So it wasn't the right fit, and I think we mutually agreed or realized that. I think where it began to get hard, though, was after the 95 Theses went out in the October of 2023, and that's where. And this is completely separate from the parish. Someone in the system, a seminarian out there decided, and I think he had snuck into the Discord server that Richard was running, had decided to flag all of the clergy who were involved with the Episcopal Fellowship for Renewal and working on these theses. And he decided to file a complaint against us. Alleging basically that we were in online chat groups recruiting young people. And, of course, that just sounds awful. But, anyone who has a Facebook account or a Twitter account or anything, on a Discord server, any of these groups are, where you have to actually sign up or join, that you're talking about probably 99% of anyone today is online in some capacity or another. So, I had always viewed myself and the other clergy in there as being the adults in the room. And so I was the one who said, we're all going to use our real names. We're going to say where we're from. So I developed a naming convention standard where we had to put our first and last name in the diocese we were affiliated with. And, I was conscious of all the training I had received. And sure enough, his complaint went nowhere. It was, it just was dismissed out of hand, but it did the damage it was intended to do, which, there may not be any official blacklist in these cases, but, I all of a sudden found that I had, because of my work with Reconquista, I had conservative Episcopal churches reaching out to me from all over the country, asking me to apply, and I would, but somehow my application didn't get forwarded from the bishop's office, or once it was forwarded, I had one case in particular where the bishop just intervened, stepped in, and sent a letter to me and to my bishop and nearly everyone else she could think of, that I was to have nothing to do with her diocese or the church. And this was a conservative 1928 Book of Common Prayer parish. I mean, we were a perfect fit, and she derailed that. So, that actually led me to write an article called debunking myths, conducting a clergy search according to the canons. So if you actually read the rules of the Episcopal Church, churches, congregations have a right to call whomever they want in terms of, provided that man or woman is ordained in the Episcopal Church and is a priest in good standing, they have a right to call that person, and the bishop can give advice. But if the bishop objects, the vestry only has 60 days, I think, to review the bishop's concerns, but then can overrule the bishop, right? But congregations have forgotten their rights. They've forgotten, they don't read the rules. Bishops have, I think, aggrandized themselves and assumed quite a lot of power and authority that they don't have according to the rules of the church. So part of my job, or what one of my hopes in writing that article, was simply to educate congregations, parishes, and search committees, those people who are, if there's going to be a Reconquista, are absolutely necessary, and they need to understand what their rights are. And clergy and search need to understand what their rights are. That no, a bishop can't not forward your application. So it's and unfortunately, there's no real recourse. What do you do? This is one of the problems with these hierarchies that we get ourselves. We create for ourselves.
Right. So now you're pastor of what's the name of the church again?
It's the First Congregational Church of Woodbury, and also the First Ecclesiastical Society of Woodbury, which I always like to tout that, because that means we go all the way back to the time when church and town in Connecticut were one. And so when settlers came over from England, the Puritans came over from England, they would get a charter from the colonial legislature to tax, and they were given the right to tax the townsfolk to raise money to build a church, a meeting house, and to hire a parson, a minister. So these ecclesiastical societies go back. Mine goes back 355 years to 1670, and then or actually to 1659, and then the church itself was established in 1670. So it's the old, what they call the old standing order of Connecticut. And the principle of congregationalism has always been, I think, in part because of what we've just been discussing. Most of the Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England. They didn't want to leave the Church of England. They were kicked out at the Great Ejection in 1660 after the Civil War. But prior to that, their actual effort and goal was to purify the Church of England. And so they were able to do, they were able to try that, or attempt it in Massachusetts and in Connecticut. And that's what my church is very much a part of. But one of the things that that's the tradition my church is very much a part of. But one of the things I think they learned quickly was that hierarchies, whether they're presbyteries or consociations or even general courts, the secular power, or certainly bishops, have a way of interfering in the lives of congregations. So the congregational principle is very, very much, each congregation is autonomous and can call its own minister and can determine its own criteria for membership. And obviously there's 1,000 ways that can go bad. Right. I mean, but in cases like this, in my own, I've benefited greatly because, like I said, I had conservative Episcopal churches in Connecticut asking me to apply, and my application wasn't forwarded. Here, we were able to just cut out the middleman, and I could apply directly. And I was talking immediately to the people who would eventually, the congregation who would eventually vote on whether to hire me or not call me or not call me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most definitely. So do you think would you say that the congregational system is best for Reconquista, or do you think there are benefits to each polity in terms of Reconquista? What would you say?
I think that, polity is, there's a lot to like, and there's benefits and upside to different polities. But I think when it comes to Reconquista, a congregational polity will be the easiest for the reasons I've just described. And this is something Richard said on one of his very first videos that I remember watching. He sort of put up all of the logos of the mainline denominations, and he himself said, a group like a church like the Episcopal Church will probably be the hardest and the last, but churches like Presbyterian or even further down the into the low church ecosystem, American Baptist or Congregationalist, will be not easier, but you have fewer institutional roadblocks because
Right.
you are the congregation. It has the last word. The congregation can call its minister, and so when you think about the fact that not only are we just talking about the United Church of Christ, but the North American Congregational Christian Conference and the Conservative Congregational Christian Conference. Those are the three main Congregationalist bodies. But then you've got the American Baptists. You have a lot of other groups that have split off from Congregationalism, who split off from sort of the New England Puritan tradition, but retained the congregational polity. So and that's probably the majority of American churches, if we're to add them all up. So, if you I think if you want to approach Reconquista from that avenue, certainly your congregational polity gives the power was never ceded to any other authority.
Right. So I want to ask, so the church that you're at now, was it had, from what I understand or what I've been told, it had closed its doors for a while, hadn't it?
It had. I mean, they had voted in 2019 to suspend worship. So they never voted to close, but they had voted to suspend worship, and then they were going to throw a celebration of their 350th anniversary in 2020. And I think that I think people were thinking in the back of their head that really will be it. We'll go out, but we'll go out celebrating what this was. COVID hit, and that may have been that may have been God's way of saying, hold on. So because everything shut down for basically 2 or 3 years, and during that time, a handful, a remnant, if you will, of the congregation, and this is one of my favorite. This is one of the things that made me really think this is God's hand is in this. One of the members of the congregation, the deacon, the chairman of the board of deacons, he's 10th generation in this congregation. He goes back, his family and his name go back to 1670, right? So the continuity in this place, the blessing I think that God has blessed this church with over centuries, really spoke to me. And I thought, well, I cannot not try this, right? And that was the feeling of this remnant group when we started talking late last year. We have to try one more time. So that's the spirit that we've all entered into this with. And by God's grace, we've doubled the size of the congregation. I mean, we've added 10 more people. So we've gone from 10 to 20, but that's great. I mean, that's 100%, that's, we've doubled the size. And what I have found is that I am now no longer hiding in plain sight. There's really no restriction. I'm not self-censoring anymore when I'm in the pulpit, and people are responding to that because they want to hear truth. They come to church expecting to hear the truth, and when they're lied to, either by omission or outright lies, which I think the progressive church is doing. Right. Then they leave, or if they hang on, they're suffering.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely. So there is a conservative tendency to run from liberals and institutions that are going liberal. We see that, all over the place. I actually grew up in a Southern Baptist context. I was in the Southern Baptist Convention since I was in diapers. There's a ton of people. Southern Baptist Convention, I want to remind everyone before I say this, the Southern Baptist Convention, by the Baptist Faith and Message, does not allow women pastors.
Right.
Does not support same-sex marriage. But there's been a sort of a drift for a couple years. There was a drift for a couple years towards CRT and critical race theory and some of these more DEI initiatives within the SBC. So because of that, there were a lot of conservatives who remember how conservative the SBC actually is because of this shift. Instead of, I mean, if the SBC is so easy to change. All you have to do is elect a conservative president, show up to the convention, elect a conservative president. These people, seeing this, instead of doing that, opted to run away.
Right.
And there have been tons of churches who have left the Southern Baptist Convention, conservative churches, because, what's the dude's name? J.D. Greer, for example, he wants to institute CRT. He wants to change the name to Great Commission Baptist and all these different things because it's associated with racism or whatever. So there's this conservative tendency, even in good situations like the SBC, to run away from the institution and start something new because we just don't want to face this. So what would you say to those conservatives who do have that knee-jerk reaction, who are thinking, man, well, why don't we just leave and start something new?
Well, it's funny because, William Wolfe and all those guys with Center for Baptist Leadership are trying to keep exactly that from happening. They're basically saying,
Right.
Stop, don't leave. There's, yes, we're in decline, but we're still 12 million members, and we're still the largest single Protestant denomination with 6 seminaries. And, we're, like it or not, we're the giant, the elephant in the room. And why would we just give that away? And so I actually wrote an article in American Reformer that came out about a week ago. I think was part of a larger series of articles that they asked people to write. And I said the same thing. I said, look, don't give up the ship. Don't give up this institution. Denominations are actually worth fighting for because they're the uniquely American way of doing religion. Yes, there is the strong independent streak of me and my Bible, and maybe a couple of us getting together in a house church or in a small church somewhere. That's absolutely 100% American, kind of goes with that frontier spirit. But there's also parallel to that an institutionalism, a denominational tradition in this country that goes all the way back to our founding. I've just described it in the case of the Connecticut, the ancient standing order, and this is. This is part of our civic duty in a way, in the same way that the American government, the American system is predicated on the fact that the citizen will be involved, the citizen will be informed, the citizen will show up at the town meeting. And when he doesn't do that, then party politics and the party machine kicks in, and special interests and large, big money starts to come in to buy votes and change the system. They're only able to do that because the ordinary citizen has given up his duty. He'd rather watch television or play baseball or nothing wrong with those things in particular. But I think it was Neil Postman who said we're amusing ourselves to death, right? Well, if you think about it, the American denomination is the equivalent of the town meeting, of the local legislature, of the county government. This is our way of covenanting together with other fellow believers to be part of something larger than ourselves and to have each other's back. So yes, there's an American impulse, I think, a frontier spirit, a rugged individualism, even a libertarianism that I'm not going to try to root that out. That's part of who we are as that's part of our American character. But there's an equally valid, equally important civic mindedness that the denomination really represents. So that was my thesis in that article. Don't give this up. Don't give the left what it wants. They know how important it is to run these institutions, to have their hands and fingers pulling the levers of power. So, and they've taken over every other denomination. The Episcopal Church at its height was never more than 4 million members. I think the PCUSA was similar as well, right? But they knew that those institutions had to be targeted for subversion because they were so embedded in the American hierarchy, right? In the American elite establishment, in the American power structure, the Ivy Leagues, the white shoe law firms, the corporations. They knew they had to get to those, and the denomination was an easy way to do that.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely. So what would you say to a young man, maybe about my age, who says, I love this, I want to get involved, what should I do? What would you say?
Well, I think there's 2 tracks. One is go out and become a professional in fields where we need them, whether it's, an electrician, a plumber, one of the trades, or engineering or something where you're going to have a living, where you're going to be stable, where you're going to be able to buy a home in a community and put down roots and provide for your family. Because That's what we need. Those are the men we need to join our churches, men who can stay for 40 or 50 years and raise their children and see their grandchildren, men who can become join the sessions and the vestries and sit on commissions on ministry and ordination councils and all of that. That's primarily what we need in the first wave of this. And as a layperson, you're largely insulated from any kind of the shenanigans that I faced, right? Because you're not really a target for discipline or the weaponization of discipline the way it was used in my case. And the bishop can't touch you, the presbytery can't touch you. I realize there's church discipline, but for the most part, we're not talking about anything that's going to even anywhere come close to triggering that. Whereas clergy, yeah, it's easy to bully clergy. Bishops can bully clergy, sessions can bully clergy, vestries can bully clergy. So we need godly men in the pew who are demanding this and demanding that their pastors be orthodox and biblical. So that would be the first track. The second track is if you're really called to the ministry, to the ordained ministry, we need to find ways to help you. We need to find ways to get you trained, first of all, seminary educated, and we need to find ways to get you ordained. And that's going to be, hard in a church like the Episcopal Church, less hard but difficult in a church like the PCUSA. And so we probably need to figure out how do we build sort of parallel pathways to get our people deployed into these churches. And then I think we also need to figure out ways to fund them, right? Because the low-hanging fruit here are going to be the struggling congregations, the ones without the big endowments, the ones that will close in 5 years. And they're not going to be able to necessarily pay a man a living wage. So we need to find ways to, or at least if he's got a wife and children, we need to find ways to be able to fund these men, for at least 5 years while they're trying to get their churches replanted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my last question to you is, what tactics that you see maybe in the UCC or the PCUSA or the Episcopal Church, the Episcopal Church may, like you said, may be more difficult, but what tactics did you see the liberals use in order to take these denominations that you think we can use maybe in reverse, or maybe be aware of as we attempt to retake these churches?
Well, so I've been teaching an adult Sunday school class on J. Gresham Machen's book, Christianity and Liberalism. And it's remarkable just to read that book 100 years after he went through what he went through, because nearly everything he said and predicted has come to pass, right? So I think that what you have to realize here is that they've been doing this for at least 100 years. We don't have 100 years. These churches don't have 100 years. Most of these churches are going to close by, I think the date is 2050. I think a lot will close even sooner than that, right? So we need to think about more aggressive tactics in terms of, how do we accomplish something in the next 5 to 10 years? We don't have the luxury of a long march through the institutions. I also think they'll see us coming from a mile away. They were able to do this 100 years ago because Christians were asleep. Most people were completely oblivious, or it wouldn't even occur to them that, the pastor, this lovely man, would ever have anything but their best interest and the institution's best interests at heart. Looking back on it, you can easily see that this was a deliberate attempt at subversion, and they succeeded, and that these were in many cases wolves in sheep's clothing. But we don't have that timeline, and I also think we don't want to be wolves in sheep's clothing in the reverse, right? We don't. Our yes should be yes, our no should be no. And what I have found is that there is tremendous power in that. There is tremendous power in just preaching the truth, and so. That I think should be our primary sword.
Most definitely. Most definitely. I thank you all for watching today. Tell me how much you liked it in the comments, because we don't allow negativity here. I am a dictator when it comes to the comment section. So make sure to like and subscribe and share this around. This really helps get the message out there, get the podcast out there. Tell your friends. There's a Presbyterians for the Kingdom podcast now. So thank you so much, Reverend Dell, for coming on, sir.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. God bless.
God bless you.